Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. In today's episode, we travel back to 1850. This is the story of Mercy Whitfield, a black girl who made 14 trips across a treacherous river. The current was unforgiving. The night was brutal. And each time she returned, she was carrying giants on her shoulders. This is a heavy one. Take a breath. Listen closely. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know the city and country you're tuning in from. Your support is what keeps these stories alive instead of buried. Clears throat, let's begin. During the winter of 1850, something unbelievable was unfolding along the frozen edges of the Ohio River. Night after night, under skies so dark you couldn't see your hand if you held it in front of your face, men were disappearing from the Kentucky side and showing up again in Ohio. Big men. Strong men. Field hands with shoulders built to haul 200 pounds of cotton. Men who had never learned to swim. Men who were more terrified of water than they were of the whip. And every last one of them was being led by a child. Her name was Mercy Whitfield. She was 11 years old. She weighed only 63 pounds. And she would go down as one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad that history simply forgot to write down. This is her story. Back in 1850, the Ohio River was more than just a stretch of water. It marked the line between two completely different existences. On the southern bank sat Kentucky, a slave state where human beings were traded like cattle. Across the water, on the northern side, was Ohio, a free state where that same human being could walk the streets unchained. The gap between bondage and freedom was sometimes less than 1,000 feet. But those 1,000 feet of cold, dark, rushing water might as well have stretched for an ocean. The river had a mind of its own. In certain spots, it was shallow enough just to walk across. In others, the current could drag a full-grown man under before he could even gasp. The riverbed was scattered with fallen trees, jagged rocks, and the remains of those who had tried and failed to make it across. The local fishermen understood its dangers. They gave it the respect it demanded. Most wouldn't even take their boats out after dark. But for enslaved people who were desperate enough to risk everything for freedom, the Ohio River was the only way. And in 1850, that path turned even deadlier. On September 18th of that year, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. That law changed everything. Before 1850, if an enslaved person made it to a free state, there was a real chance they could build a new life. The laws were messy. Enforcement was patchy. Plenty of northern communities refused to help the slave catchers. The Fugitive Slave Act wiped all of that away. Under this new law, federal commissioners were appointed in every county to handle cases of accused runaways. These commissioners got $10 for every person they sent back into slavery, but only $5 if they set them free. The money practically guaranteed the outcome. The law also demanded that everyday citizens help capture runaways. If you refused, you could be fined $1,000 and thrown in jail for 6 months. If you helped a runaway, the penalties were even worse. Almost overnight, the entire North became a hunting ground. Professional slave catchers poured across the Ohio River. They set up camps all along the banks. They paid people in free black communities for information. They watched the roads, the bridges, the ferry crossings. They knew desperate people would try desperate things, and they were ready for it. Over in Ripley, Ohio, a small town directly across the river from Kentucky, the slave catchers were especially busy. Ripley had a reputation. It was known as one of the most important stops on the Underground Railroad. The town sat up on a bluff overlooking the river, and at the top of that bluff stood a house with a lantern that stayed lit every single night. That lantern was a signal. It told runaways on the Kentucky side that help was waiting. The slave catchers knew about that lantern. They watched it. They counted the people heading up the hill. They waited. But they never watched the water itself. Not like they should have. About 3 miles downriver from Ripley, where the Ohio took a sharp turn west, there was a stretch of water the locals called the Devil's Elbow. The current there acted strange. It pushed against itself, spinning off eddies and whirlpools that could trap a boat and spin it around for hours. The banks were crowded with willow trees, their roots stretching into the water like grasping fingers. During the spring floods, debris would pile up against those roots, forming underwater traps that could catch a swimmer and hold them under until they drowned. Nobody tried to cross at the Devil's Elbow. It was just too dangerous. The slave catchers didn't even bother patrolling it. That was their mistake. Because there was one person who understood the Devil's Elbow better than anyone walking this earth. One person who had spent years studying its rhythms, memorizing its hidden paths, figuring out which rocks were solid and which ones would slide out from under you. One person who could feel her way through its darkness without needing to see a thing. That person was an 11-year-old girl named Mercy. Mercy Whitfield was born in 1839 on a tobacco plantation about 12 miles south of the river. The plantation belonged to a man named Cornelius Whitfield, a third-generation Kentucky farmer whose family had been growing tobacco since before the Revolution. The Whitfield place wasn't the biggest in the area, but it did well enough. Cornelius owned 47 enslaved people, and he ran things with what he liked to call efficiency. Mercy never got to know her mother. The woman bled out giving birth to her, a hemorrhage nobody tried very hard to stop. Mercy's father had been sold 8 months before she was born, shipped off to a cotton plantation down in Mississippi. She would never even learn his name. In the world of American slavery, this wasn't anything unusual. Families were torn apart all the time. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, siblings from each other. The law didn't recognize slave marriages. The law didn't recognize slave families. The law only recognized property. Mercy was raised by an old man named Moses. He was 62 years old when she was born, practically ancient by enslaved field worker standards. Moses had outlasted everyone on the Whitfield plantation. He had buried 3 owners, 2 wives, and 7 of his own children. He walked with a permanent limp from a beating he took back in 1819. His left eye was clouded over with cataracts. His hands were twisted up with arthritis. But Moses had one thing that kept him valuable. He knew how to work the drying barns. Curing tobacco was a craft. You had to get the temperature exactly right. You had to control the humidity. One mistake and you could lose an entire season's harvest. Cornelius Whitfield couldn't afford to lose Moses. So Moses survived. And Moses, for reasons he never really explained, decided to raise Mercy as his own. From the time she could walk, Mercy followed Moses everywhere. She learned how to read the tobacco leaves, how to tell when they were ready for cutting. She learned how to tend the fires in the curing barns, keeping them low and steady through the long nights. And she learned something else too, something Moses taught her in whispers when nobody else was around. She learned the river. Moses had grown up near the Ohio, on a plantation just 3 miles from its banks. Back when he was young, before his leg got broken, he had been a strong swimmer. He had crossed the river twice himself, trying to escape. Both times they caught him. Both times they beat him and brought him back. But he never forgot what he learned. The river had its own logic. The current moved differently depending on the season. The bottom shifted, but not randomly. There were paths through the water, places where a person could walk if they knew exactly where to put their feet. Moses had mapped those paths in his head over 40 years of watching, and he passed that map along to Mercy. Why did he teach her? Maybe he saw something in her that reminded him of himself. Maybe he wanted his knowledge to live on even after his body gave out. Maybe he just loved her. And love makes people do things that don't make logical sense. Whatever the reason, by the time Mercy turned 9, she knew the Devil's Elbow better than she knew the plantation where she slept every night. She would sneak out after dark, slipping through the tobacco fields like a ghost. She would reach the river and step into its waters, feeling the current press against her legs. She learned which rocks were safe to step on. She learned where the bottom fell away. She learned how to read the water's surface, to spot the ripples that meant danger and the smooth patches that meant solid ground. The cold never bothered her much. Her body was small, but it was tough. Years of hard work had toughened her in ways most kids never experience. She could hold her breath for almost 2 minutes. She could float on her back for hours. She could move through the water without making a sound. By the time she was 10, Mercy had crossed the river all by herself. She wasn't trying to run away. That wasn't the point. She crossed just to prove she could do it. Then she crossed back. She stood on the Kentucky bank in the pitch black, water dripping from her thin dress, and she smiled. She had found something that was hers and hers alone. Then 1850 came and changed everything. The Fugitive Slave Act passed in September, and by October, the Whitfield plantation was buzzing with talk. Cornelius Whitfield read through the new law and felt satisfied. He had lost 3 enslaved people to runaways over the last 10 years, and he never got any of them back. Now, he figured, the tide was finally turning in his favor. His son, Thomas Jr., was even more excited about it. Thomas was 19 years old, and he had grown up watching his father run the place. He was eager to prove himself. He was also cruel in a way his father wasn't. Cornelius Whitfield used violence like a tool. He beat enslaved people when he thought it was necessary for keeping order. He didn't exactly enjoy it. It was just part of running the business. Thomas was something else entirely. Thomas enjoyed it. He looked for excuses to punish people. He made up violations. He took his time during whippings, watching the skin tear, listening to the screams. The enslaved people on the Whitfield place had learned to fear Thomas even more than they feared his father. In November of 1850, Thomas made an announcement. He had heard whispers that some of the enslaved people were planning to run. He didn't know who. He didn't have proof. But he meant to send a message. He picked Moses. The official reason was theft. Thomas claimed Moses had stolen food from the main house. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Moses hadn't left the curing barns in weeks. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the message. They tied Moses to a post out in the yard where everybody could see. Thomas did the beating himself. He used a whip with a braided leather tip, the kind that cuts deep. He gave Moses 30 lashes. For a younger man, it would have been pure agony, but survivable. For a 62-year-old man with arthritis and a bad leg, it was almost a death sentence. Moses hung on, but barely. He spent 3 weeks in his cabin, too weak to move. Mercy took care of him, bringing water and food, cleaning his wounds with rags soaked in salt water. She sat with him at night and listened to him breathe, terrified each breath might be his last. During those 3 weeks, Cornelius Whitfield made a decision. Moses wasn't useful anymore. That beating had broken something inside him. He would never work the curing barns again. And a slave who couldn't work was a slave who needed to be sold. Cornelius found a buyer down in Mississippi. A cotton planter named Richardson, who was always looking for cheap labor. Richardson didn't care that Moses was old and broken. He would work Moses until he dropped, and then he would just buy another one. That was how the cotton plantations operated. The sale was set for December 15th. Mercy found out about it on December 8th. She overheard 2 of the house servants talking. Moses had 7 days. That night, Mercy made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She was going to save him. Her plan was simple because it had to be. Mercy had no money, no allies, no experience. All she had was her knowledge of the river and her absolute determination to use it. Moses could barely walk. He certainly couldn't run. He couldn't swim. He couldn't fight back. In every practical way, he was helpless. But Mercy had spent 2 years studying the devil's elbow. And she knew something nobody else knew. At the sharpest bend in the curve, where the current slammed hardest against the western bank, there was a sandbar. It sat about 3 feet below the surface, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And that sandbar created a pathway. The path was narrow. In some spots, it was only 18 inches wide. A grown man would have to walk carefully, placing each foot just right. One wrong step and the current would snatch him away. But if he followed the path exactly, if he trusted the person guiding him, he could cross the river without ever having to swim. The water would never come higher than his chest. Mercy had walked that path dozens of times. She knew every inch of it. She knew where the sandbar dipped and where it rose. She knew where the rock stuck up and where the mud would try to suck your feet down. She could walk it blindfolded without missing a step. The question was whether Moses could walk it at all. On the night of December 12th, 3 days before he was supposed to be sold, Mercy put her plan into motion. She waited until the plantation went quiet. The main house went dark around 10 o'clock. The overseer's cabin followed about an hour later. By midnight, the only sounds were the wind moving through the tobacco fields and dogs barking somewhere off in the distance. Mercy crept over to Moses's cabin. She found him awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at nothing. His back was still covered in scabs from the beating. His hands shook constantly now, a tremor he couldn't control. She didn't bother explaining what they were doing. There wasn't time for that. She just took his hand and led him outside. They moved slowly. Moses couldn't walk fast even on his best days, and this was far from his best day. Every step seemed to drain something out of him. His breathing was ragged. His limp was worse than ever. It took them 2 hours just to cover the 3 miles to the river. When they finally reached the bank at the Devil's Elbow, Moses stopped. He stared at the water, black and rushing in the darkness, and Mercy saw something she had never seen in him before. Fear. Moses had crossed this river twice back when he was young, and twice they caught him and beat him. The river meant pain to him. The river meant failure. Looking at it now, old and broken, he couldn't imagine trying to cross it again. Mercy squeezed his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just stepped into the water and pulled him along with her. The cold hit them instantly. December water in the Ohio River hovers just above freezing. It steals heat from your body faster than air ever could. Most people stepping into water this cold would gasp, panic, lose control. Mercy had trained herself not to react. She kept her breathing even. She kept moving. Moses stumbled behind her, his bad leg struggling to find purchase on the riverbed. The current pushed against him, trying to knock him over. He was bigger than Mercy, heavier, and the water affected him more. Mercy positioned herself upstream, using her body to break the current. It wasn't much, 63 pounds against the force of a whole river, but it helped. It gave Moses a slightly easier path. They reached the sandbar. Here, the water dropped from chest height to waist height. Moses could stand more easily, but the path was narrow and the darkness was absolute. He couldn't see where to step. Mercy guided him with her hands. She placed his feet on the sandbar one at a time, showing him where the solid ground was. She moved backward, facing him, walking the path from memory while keeping her attention on his every move. It took 45 minutes to make it across. When they reached the Ohio side, Moses collapsed on the bank. He was shaking violently, his body struggling to warm itself. Mercy pulled him into the shelter of the willow trees and covered him with leaves and branches, anything to hold in the heat. She sat beside him as the sky started to lighten. They had done it. They had crossed the river. Moses was in a free state. But freedom in 1850 wasn't the same as safety. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could chase runaways anywhere. Moses needed to keep moving. He needed to reach Canada, the only place where American law couldn't touch him. Mercy knew she couldn't take him that far. She was 11 years old and she had to get back to the plantation before dawn. If they found her missing, there would be questions. If anyone connected her disappearance with Moses's escape, there would be consequences. So she did the only thing she could. She pointed Moses toward Ripley, told him to look for the lantern on the hill, and then she slipped back into the river. The return trip was harder. She was exhausted. The cold had drained her strength. The current felt stronger going back than it had coming over. But she made it. She crawled out of the water on the Kentucky side just as the first light touched the horizon. She was shaking so badly she could barely walk. Her fingers had turned white. Her lips were blue. She made it back to the slave quarters and collapsed on her cot, pulling her thin blanket over her wet clothes. When the overseer came through at dawn to wake everybody up, Mercy was lying in her bed, apparently asleep. Nobody suspected a thing. 3 days later, when Cornelius Whitfield found out Moses was gone, he was furious. He sent riders out in every direction. He hired slave catchers. He offered a reward of $200, which was serious money in 1850. They never found Moses. Months later, Mercy heard through the whispered network of enslaved communication that Moses had made it to Canada. He was living in a small town called St. Catharines, working as a carpenter's helper. He was free. Mercy had done the impossible. She had guided a broken old man across one of the most dangerous rivers in America in the middle of winter in pitch darkness. And she realized she could do it again. Word spread quietly through the Whitfield plantation and beyond. There was a way across the river. There was a path the slave catchers didn't know about. There was someone who could guide you. Nobody knew that guide was an 11-year-old girl. The people who came to her just saw a child. They didn't expect anything. That was part of what made it work. The second crossing came in January. His name was Samuel. He was 28 years old, 6 feet 4 inches, and he weighed 240 pounds. He worked in the tobacco fields alongside 30 other men, and he had hands big enough to wrap entirely around a fence post. Samuel had tried to escape twice before. Both times he had tried to swim across. Both times the current had beaten him. He nearly drowned the second time, pulled from the water by slave catchers who beat him unconscious and dragged him back to his owner. Samuel was terrified of water. Just looking at the river made him shake, but he was even more terrified of spending the rest of his life in chains. When he heard about the path at the Devil's Elbow, he went looking for the person who knew it. He found Mercy. At first, he didn't believe it. He looked at this tiny girl, this child, and he couldn't imagine that she held his freedom in her hands. But Mercy spoke with a certainty that made him listen. She described the path in detail. She explained how the current moved, where the sandbar lay, how deep the water would be at each point. She talked like someone who had done this before because she had. They crossed on a night with no moon. The darkness was so complete that Samuel couldn't see Mercy even when she was standing right in front of him. He could only feel her hand holding his, pulling him forward. He was shaking before they even reached the water. When his feet touched the cold current, he almost turned back. Every part of his body screamed at him to run away from the river, not into it. But Mercy held his hand, and she didn't let go. Step by step, she guided him across. When the water reached his chest, he felt her grip tighten with panic. She squeezed back, steady and calm. She kept moving. She didn't hesitate. Samuel was bigger than Moses, heavier, harder to guide. The current pushed against him like something alive. Twice he stumbled. Twice Mercy caught him, her small hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. It took over an hour to cross. When Samuel reached the other side, he fell to his knees and wept. He was a giant of a man, and he had been led to freedom by a child who barely came up to his waist. He tried to thank her, but Mercy was already slipping back into the water. She had to get back before dawn. There was no time for thanks. Samuel made it to Canada 6 weeks later. He settled in Toronto, found work at a lumberyard, and eventually married a woman from Jamaica who had escaped slavery in the Caribbean. They had 4 children. He never forgot the girl who saved him. The third crossing happened in February, the fourth in March. By April, Mercy had guided 6 men across the Devil's Elbow. Every crossing was different. Each man had his own fears, his own weaknesses, his own reasons for running. Some were young and strong. Some were old and broken. Some were running toward something. Family in the north, promises of work, dreams of freedom. Others were just running away, escaping brutal masters, avoiding being sold to the deep south, fleeing punishment for things they didn't do. Mercy treated them all the same. She held their hands. She guided their feet. She led them through the darkness to the other side. And she never got caught. Part of her success was the location. The Devil's Elbow was genuinely dangerous, and the slave catchers genuinely stayed away from it. They focused their attention on the easier crossings, the places where the river was wider but calmer. They never imagined anyone would deliberately pick the most treacherous stretch of water on the entire border. Part of her success was her size. Mercy was a child. She was invisible in ways adults couldn't be. She could move through the night without drawing attention. She could slip away from the plantation and come back without anyone noticing. The overseers saw her as harmless. The other enslaved people saw her as just another kid. Nobody saw her as a threat. And part of her success was her skill. Mercy had spent years learning the river. She knew it in ways nobody else did. She could feel changes in the current through her feet. She could hear the difference between safe water and dangerous water. She could navigate in total darkness using only her memory and her instincts. She was, in her own quiet way, a genius. By the summer of 1851, Mercy had completed 10 crossings. 10 men had walked the path through the Devil's Elbow. 10 men had reached the Ohio side. 10 men had found their way to freedom. The Whitfield plantation was in chaos. Cornelius Whitfield couldn't understand what was happening. He had lost 8 enslaved people in a single year, more than ever before. The losses were devastating financially. Even worse, they were devastating to his sense of control. He hired more overseers. He increased patrols. He built a new fence around the slave quarters. He threatened to punish everyone if anyone else escaped. Nothing worked. The escapes kept happening. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had his own theory. He figured someone on the plantation was helping the runaways. Someone who knew the roads, the schedules, the patrol patterns, someone on the inside. He started watching. He questioned enslaved people one by one, looking for holes in their stories. He punished anyone who seemed suspicious. He created an atmosphere of pure terror. And still, he never suspected Mercy. Why would he? She was a child. She was small. She was quiet. She did her work without complaining. She never talked back. She never drew attention to herself. She was invisible. The 11th crossing happened in August of 1851. His name was Gabriel, and he was different from the others. Gabriel was a preacher. He had taught himself to read using a stolen Bible. And he held secret services in the woods behind the plantation where he lived. He preached about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He preached about the Promised Land. He preached about freedom. His master found out about the services and decided to make an example of him. Gabriel was scheduled to be whipped in public. 50 lashes, enough to kill a weaker man. The night before the punishment, he ran. He found his way to the Devil's Elbow through whispers and rumors. When he met Mercy, he fell to his knees and prayed. He prayed for her. He prayed for her strength, her courage, her wisdom. He prayed that God would protect her, guide her, keep her safe. Mercy stood there uncomfortable, not sure how to respond. She wasn't religious. She had seen too much suffering to believe in a God who cared about enslaved people. But Gabriel's faith was real, and she couldn't dismiss it. They crossed that night. The water was warmer in August, but the current was stronger. Summer storms had swollen the river, changing its patterns. The sandbar had shifted slightly, and Mercy had to adjust her path. Gabriel followed her with absolute trust. He believed that God had sent this child to save him and he wasn't about to question God's methods. When they reached the other side, Gabriel blessed her. He placed his hands on her head and spoke words that Mercy didn't fully understand. Words about grace and mercy and divine purpose. Then he disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward the lantern on the hill. Gabriel made it to Canada. He kept preaching, starting a small church in a town called Dresden. He never mentioned Mercy by name in his sermons, but he often talked about the child who had led him through the waters. He called her an angel. He wasn't the only one. As summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, the legend grew. All through the slave communities of Kentucky, people whispered about the Devil's Elbow. They whispered about the path through the darkness. They whispered about the guide. Some said the guide was a ghost. Some said it was a spirit of the river itself. Some said it was an angel sent by God to lead his people to freedom. Nobody said it was an 11-year-old girl. The 12th crossing happened in November, the 13th in December. By January of 1852, Mercy had guided 14 men across the river. 14 crossings, 14 giants, 14 acts of impossible courage. And then everything changed. The winter of 1852 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks straight. The Ohio River, which usually resisted freezing because of its current, started developing ice along its banks. The Devil's Elbow became even more treacherous. The cold water sapped strength faster than ever. Ice chunks floated in the current like knives. Mercy knew she should stop. The conditions were too dangerous. Even her knowledge of the river couldn't protect against water this cold. But people kept coming. They came because they were desperate. They came because they had no other choice. They came because they had heard about the path through the devil's elbow and they believed it was their only hope. Mercy couldn't turn them away. In February of 1852, she agreed to guide a man named Isaac. He was 34 years old, a blacksmith from a plantation near Louisville. He had powerful arms and clever hands, and his owner had promised to sell him to a plantation in Alabama, where he would never see his family again. Isaac had a wife and 2 children. They were still enslaved on a different plantation, but he had hopes of earning enough money up north to buy their freedom. It was a desperate hope, almost certainly impossible, but it was all he had. Mercy agreed to guide him. They set out on a night when the temperature was 8 degrees below zero. The wind was blowing from the northwest, carrying sheets of ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Mercy had wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she could find. But she was still shivering before they even reached the river. The devil's elbow was transformed. Ice had built up along the banks, extending 15 feet into the water. The current had shifted, pushing harder against the eastern side. The sandbar, Mercy discovered when she stepped into the water, had moved again. She had to find the path by feel. Isaac followed her, his teeth chattering so loudly she could hear them over the wind. He was bigger than her, stronger, but the cold affected him more. His movements got sluggish. His grip on her hand weakened. Halfway across, he stumbled. The current caught him immediately, spinning him away from the sandbar into deeper water. Mercy lunged after him, grabbing his arm, but his weight was too much. He was pulling her down with him. For one terrible moment, Mercy thought they were both going to die. But Isaac found his footing. Some instinct, some desperate surge of strength let him plant his feet on a rock she hadn't known was there. He pushed himself upright, gasping. Mercy guided him back to the sandbar. Her hands were numb. Her legs were shaking. She could barely feel the path beneath her feet. But she kept moving. They reached the Ohio side just as Mercy's body started to fail. Her muscles were cramping. Her vision was blurring. The cold had stolen too much from her. She collapsed on the bank, unable to move. Isaac lifted her. He carried her to the shelter of the trees and held her against his chest, trying to share his body heat. He rubbed her arms and legs, forcing blood to circulate. He talked to her constantly, words of encouragement and gratitude and desperate hope. Slowly, painfully, Mercy's body started to warm. She had survived, but barely. That night, lying in the arms of a man she had just saved, Mercy made a decision. She was done. 14 crossings were enough. She had pushed her luck too far. Next time, she might not survive. She told Isaac to head for the lantern on the hill. She watched him disappear into the darkness. Then she slipped back into the river for what she believed would be the last time. The return crossing nearly killed her. The cold had sapped her strength more than she realized. The current had grown stronger. The ice had built up further. Twice she lost the path. Twice she had to stop and feel her way forward. Her numb feet searching for solid ground. She reached the Kentucky side as dawn was breaking. She crawled out of the water and lay on the frozen bank, too exhausted to move. The cold seeped into her bones. She could feel her heartbeat slowing. She thought about Moses. She thought about Samuel. She thought about all the men she had guided across the river. She thought about freedom. And then she closed her eyes. She woke 3 hours later, covered in frost, barely alive. Somehow she dragged herself back to the plantation. Somehow she made it to her cabin without being seen. Somehow she collapsed onto her cot and pulled her blanket over her body. She slept for 2 days. When she finally woke, she knew that something had changed. Her body was weaker. Her lungs hurt when she breathed. Her fingers and toes tingled constantly. The first signs of frostbite damage that would never fully heal. She had given everything she had to those 14 crossings. And she believed, truly believed, that her work was done. She was wrong. 3 months passed. Spring came to Kentucky, melting the ice, warming the river, bringing new life to the tobacco fields. Mercy recovered slowly. Her lungs healed. Her strength returned. The tingling in her fingers and toes faded to a dull ache that she learned to ignore. She went back to work. She tended the curing barns. She followed the routines that had defined her life before she discovered the river. She tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Every night she dreamed of the water. She dreamed of the current pulling at her legs, the darkness pressing against her eyes, the hands of desperate men gripping hers. She dreamed of the path through the devil's elbow, every rock and ridge memorized, every twist and turn burned into her mind. She dreamed of freedom, and every night she woke up still enslaved. The Whitfield plantation had changed during those 3 months. Cornelius Whitfield's health was failing. He spent most of his time in bed coughing blood into handkerchiefs that the house servants burned in secret. The doctors came and went, but their medicines did nothing. Something was eating him from the inside. Thomas Jr. had taken over running the plantation. He walked the fields with a whip coiled at his belt. He watched the enslaved workers with suspicious eyes. He punished infractions that his father would have ignored. The atmosphere grew darker. People whispered that Thomas was looking for someone to blame for the escapes. 14 men had vanished in less than 2 years. Someone had helped them. Someone knew the way. Thomas meant to find that someone. In May of 1852, he made his move. The target was a woman named Ruth. She was 43 years old, a house servant who had worked for the Whitfield family her entire life. Ruth had never tried to escape. She had never shown any interest in running, but she had one characteristic that made Thomas suspicious. Ruth could read. She had learned as a child, taught by Cornelius Whitfield's mother, who believed that house servants should be educated enough to follow written instructions. Ruth had never used her literacy for anything subversive. She read recipes. She read labels on medicine bottles. She kept inventory lists for the kitchen. But Thomas knew that literacy was dangerous. An enslaved person who could read could communicate in ways that overseers couldn't monitor. They could pass written messages. They could create maps. They could document routes and schedules. Thomas convinced himself that Ruth was the key to the escapes. He interrogated her for 3 days. He asked about the missing men. He asked about the river. He asked about the Underground Railroad. Ruth knew nothing. She had nothing to tell him. But Thomas didn't believe her. On the 3rd day, he brought out the whip. Mercy watched from the doorway of the curing barn. She was too far away to hear what was being said, but she could see everything. She saw Thomas raise the whip. She saw Ruth fall to her knees. She saw the first stroke land across her shoulders. Ruth screamed. The sound carried across the plantation, sharp and terrible. It was the sound of innocence being punished. Of cruelty exercising its power simply because it could. Thomas whipped Ruth 30 times. When he was finished, she lay in the dirt, barely breathing. Her dress was soaked with blood. Her back was a ruin of torn flesh. Thomas stood over her, coiling his whip, and announced to everyone watching that this was what happened to people who helped runaways. He didn't care if Ruth was innocent. He wanted to send a message. The message was received. That night, Mercy lay in her cabin and stared at the ceiling. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was clenched so tight, her teeth ached. Ruth had done nothing. Ruth had helped no one. Ruth had been beaten nearly to death for crimes that Mercy had committed. The guilt was overwhelming. But beneath the guilt, something else was growing, something harder, something colder, something that felt like fire and ice at the same time. Mercy had spent 2 years helping people escape. She had risked her life 14 times. She had guided giants through the darkness asking nothing in return. And now an innocent woman was lying in a cabin bleeding because of her. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had done this. Thomas with his whip and his cruelty and his endless suspicion. Thomas who enjoyed causing pain. Thomas who had beaten Moses. Thomas who had beaten Ruth. For the first time in her life, Mercy understood hatred. Not anger, not fear, not resentment, hatred, the kind that burns clean and cold, the kind that doesn't fade with time, the kind that waits. Mercy waited. The summer of 1852 was hot and dry. The tobacco crop struggled. Cornelius Whitfield grew weaker. Thomas grew more powerful. In July, Cornelius died. The funeral was a grand affair by Kentucky standards. Neighbors came from miles around. A minister spoke about Cornelius's faith, his family, his contributions to the community. No one mentioned the 47 human beings he had owned. No one mentioned the families he had destroyed, the lives he had stolen, the suffering he had caused. They buried him in the family cemetery beneath an oak tree that had stood for 100 years. Thomas inherited everything. The change was immediate. Thomas had always been cruel, but he had been constrained by his father's presence. Cornelius was a businessman. He understood that excessive brutality was counterproductive. Dead slaves couldn't work. Crippled slaves worked slowly. Fear was useful, but only in moderation. Thomas had no such understanding. In the weeks following his father's death, Thomas increased punishments dramatically. He whipped people for talking too slowly. He whipped people for looking at him wrong. He whipped people for no reason at all, simply because he felt like it. 3 enslaved people died that summer, 2 from beatings, 1 from an infection that Thomas refused to have treated. The plantation became a place of terror. And Mercy watched. She watched and she waited and she planned. She didn't know what she was planning. She didn't have a specific goal. She just knew that something was coming. Something that would change everything. In September, she found out what it was. The news came through the whispered network that connected enslaved communities across Kentucky. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had made a terrible mistake. He had cheated a man named Harrison Cole. Harrison Cole was a slave catcher. He was one of the most successful in the region, with a reputation for ruthlessness that even other slave catchers found disturbing. He had worked for the Whitfield family several times, tracking down runaways, collecting bounties. Thomas had hired Cole to capture a runaway from a neighboring plantation. Cole had succeeded, returning the men in chains. But when it came time to pay, Thomas had refused. He claimed the bounty was too high. He claimed Cole had taken too long. He offered half the agreed amount. Cole did not accept. Words were exchanged. Threats were made. Thomas ordered Cole off his property. Cole left, but he made a promise. He told Thomas that one day their positions would be reversed. One day Thomas would be the one in chains. At the time, everyone assumed it was an empty threat. Thomas was a white man, a plantation owner, protected by law and custom and the entire structure of Southern society. Harrison Cole could do nothing to him. Everyone was wrong. In October of 1852, something remarkable happened. A court in Cincinnati ruled that Thomas Whitfield Jr. was not entirely white. The case had been brought by Harrison Cole. He had done research. He had dug into the Whitfield family history, and he had discovered something that the Whitfields had hidden for 3 generations. Thomas's great-great-grandmother had been a slave. Her name was Delilah. She had been owned by Thomas's great-great-grandfather, a man named William Whitfield, who had come to Kentucky in 1792. William had taken Delilah as a concubine. She had borne him a son. That son, raised as white, had eventually inherited the plantation. He had married a white woman. His children had been considered white. His grandchildren had never known the truth. But the truth was there in documents that Harrison Cole had found. Birth records, property records, a bill of sale for Delilah dated 1789. Under the laws of Kentucky in 1852, anyone with African ancestry could be enslaved. The amount didn't matter. 1 drop of black blood made you black. 1 enslaved ancestor made you eligible for slavery. Thomas Whitfield Jr., the master of the Whitfield Plantation, the owner of 43 human beings, was legally black. The court case was complicated. Thomas hired lawyers. He fought the ruling. He argued that the documents were forged, that the claims were lies, that Harrison Cole was motivated by revenge. None of it mattered. In November of 1852, a federal marshal arrived at the Whitfield plantation. He had a warrant for Thomas's arrest. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, the same law that Thomas had used to terrorize runaways. Thomas himself was now considered a fugitive. Harrison Cole had purchased the rights to Thomas from a man in Virginia who claimed descent from William Whitfield's legitimate children. The claim was dubious at best. It probably wouldn't have held up under careful scrutiny. But the federal commissioner didn't scrutinize carefully. He received his $10 and signed the warrant. Thomas was arrested in his own parlor. They put him in chains. The same kind of chains he had used on the people he owned. They loaded him into a wagon. They drove him toward the river. Harrison Cole intended to take Thomas south. He intended to sell him to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The same fate Thomas had planned for Moses 2 years earlier. But Cole made a mistake. He underestimated the river. The crossing point Cole chose was 3 miles upstream from the Devil's Elbow at a place where ferries normally operated, but it was November and the ferryman had gone home for the night. Cole decided to wait until morning. He made camp on the Kentucky side within sight of the water. That night, a storm hit. It came from the northwest, fast and violent. The wind tore through the trees. The rain fell in sheets. The Ohio River, already swollen from autumn rains, rose 6 inches in 3 hours. Cole's camp was destroyed. His horses panicked and ran. His supplies were scattered. And Thomas, still in chains, was swept into the water. The current carried him downstream. It carried him toward the Devil's Elbow. Mercy was awake when the storm hit. She had been awake for hours, lying in her cabin, thinking about everything that had happened. She heard the wind. She heard the rain. She heard something else beneath it all. She heard the river calling. She didn't decide to go. Her body simply moved. She pulled on her clothes, slipped out of the cabin, and walked through the storm toward the water. She reached the Devil's Elbow just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the clouds. The storm was passing, but the river was chaos. The current was faster than she had ever seen it. Debris was everywhere. Logs and branches and pieces of buildings torn from upstream communities. And there, caught in the willow roots on the Kentucky side, was Thomas Whitfield Jr. He was barely conscious. The chains on his wrists had tangled in the roots, holding him in place while the current tried to pull him under. His face was bloody. His clothes were torn. He was shivering so violently that Mercy could see it from 30 feet away. She stood on the bank and watched him. He didn't see her at first. He was focused on the water, on the chains, on the desperate struggle to keep his head above the surface. His strength was failing. Another few minutes and he would go under. Mercy could let him die. The thought was clear and cold. She could stand here and watch. She could let the river do what she had dreamed of doing for months. Thomas Whitfield Jr., the man who had beaten Moses, who had beaten Ruth, who had made the plantation a place of terror, would simply vanish beneath the water. No one would know she was here. No one would blame her. The river would keep its secrets. She took a step closer. Thomas's eyes found her. Recognition flickered across his face. He knew who she was. He had seen her 1,000 times. The quiet girl who worked in the curing barns. He had never noticed her. She was invisible to him. Just another piece of property. But now, in this moment, she was the only person who could save him. He tried to speak. The water filled his mouth. He coughed, choked, struggled to keep his head up. Mercy took another step. She could see something hanging around his neck. A chain. A medallion. It swung against his chest as he thrashed, catching the early light. Her mother's medallion. Mercy's breath stopped. She had heard stories about that medallion. Moses had told her mother had worn it every day of her life. It had been given to her by Mercy's grandmother, who had brought it from Africa 50 years earlier. When Mercy's mother died, the medallion had disappeared. Now Mercy knew where it had gone. Thomas had taken it, or his father had taken it. Someone in the Whitfield family had stolen the only thing that connected Mercy to her mother, and they had worn it like a trophy. The hatred flared again, hotter than before. She could let him die. She could let the medallion sink with him, lost forever. It would be justice. It would be revenge. But it wouldn't bring the medallion back. Mercy made her decision. She didn't make it because Thomas deserved to live. He didn't. She didn't make it because she was merciful. She wasn't. She made it because she wanted something, and the only way to get it was to save the men who had taken it. She stepped into the water. The current hit her immediately, stronger than anything she had felt before. The storm had transformed the river into something wild and angry. The path she knew, the sandbar through the Devil's Elbow, was gone. The flood had reshaped everything. She pushed forward anyway. She reached Thomas and grabbed the chains that bound his wrists. The metal was cold. His hands were blue. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from physical danger. Something deeper. Thomas was afraid of her. He was afraid of this 11-year-old girl who had appeared from nowhere and was now holding his life in her hands. Good, Mercy thought. She pulled at the chains, trying to free them from the roots. They were tangled tight. She had to work at each link, finding the places where it had wrapped around branches and unwinding it carefully. Thomas watched her. He didn't speak. He couldn't speak. But his eyes never left her face. The water was rising. The current was getting stronger. Mercy's fingers were going numb. She freed the last chain. Thomas sagged against her, his weight nearly pulling them both under. She braced herself, found her footing, started to move. The path was gone, but the river was still the river. Mercy could feel its patterns even in the chaos. She could sense where the current was strongest and where it eased. She could find the places where the bottom was solid. She started to cross. It was nothing like her previous crossings. There was no sandbar to follow. There was no memorized path. There was only the water and her instincts and the weight of a man who had spent his life causing pain. Thomas tried to help. He tried to walk, to support his own weight. But the chains made it impossible. His arms were pinned in front of him. His balance was destroyed. He stumbled constantly, and every stumble pulled at Mercy's strength. Halfway across, she felt her body starting to fail. The cold was stealing her heat. The current was stealing her energy. Thomas was stealing her will. She thought about letting go. She thought about slipping beneath the surface and letting the river take her. It would be easy. It would be peaceful. But she thought about the medallion. She thought about her mother, a woman she had never known, who had died giving her life. She thought about Moses, who had raised her, who had taught her the river. She thought about all the men she had guided to freedom. Giants who had trembled in the darkness until she took their hands. She was not going to die here. She was not going to let Thomas take anything else from her. She kept moving. The Ohio side appeared through the rain like a dream. Mercy had stopped believing it was real. She had started to think the crossing would never end, that she would be walking through this terrible water forever. But there it was, solid ground. Freedom. She dragged Thomas onto the bank. She collapsed beside him, her chest heaving, her body shaking. The rain was still falling, but softer now. The storm was passing. Thomas lay on his back, staring at the sky. His breathing was ragged. His skin was gray. He looked like a man who had already died and simply hadn't noticed yet. Mercy sat up. She reached for the chain around his neck. She found the medallion and pulled it over his head. He didn't resist. He was too weak to resist anything. She held the medallion in her palm. It was silver, tarnished with age, engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. Symbols from Africa. Symbols from a world that had been stolen from her family generations ago. She had it back. Thomas's eyes found her again. He was trying to speak. His lips were moving, forming words she couldn't hear. She leaned closer. "Please," he whispered. Mercy looked at him. She looked at this man who had caused so much suffering. She looked at his chains, his wounds, his terror. She looked at everything he had become, and she felt nothing. Not hatred, not anger, not even satisfaction. The emotions had burned out of her during the crossing. All that remained was a cold clarity. "You're free now," she said. The words were strange in her mouth. She had said them before to the men she guided across the river, but she had never said them to someone like Thomas. He stared at her uncomprehending. She explained. She explained that he was in Ohio. She explained that under Ohio law, he was a free man. She explained that the chains on his wrists didn't matter because no one in this state would recognize Harrison Cole's claim. She explained that she had saved his life. And then she explained what that meant. "You owe me everything," she said. "Your breath, your heartbeat, the blood in your veins. I gave you all of it. You will live the rest of your life knowing that a slave girl pulled you from the river. You will wake up every morning and remember that you exist because I chose to let you exist." Thomas was crying. The tears cut tracks through the dirt on his face. He was shaking, and not just from the cold. "That's your punishment," Mercy said. "Not death, not pain. Knowing every day forever." She stood up. Her legs were weak, but they held her. She looked down at Thomas one more time. "Go north," she said. "Go to Canada. Start over. Try to become someone worth saving." And then she turned and walked back toward the river. Thomas called after her. He called her name. He begged her to wait. She didn't look back. The return crossing was easier than it should have been. The storm had passed completely now, and the river was calming. The current was still strong, but manageable. Mercy found her way back to the Kentucky side without incident. She reached the plantation just as the sun was rising. The compound was in chaos. News of Thomas's arrest had spread. The enslaved people didn't know what would happen next. The overseers didn't know who was in charge. Mercy slipped into her cabin unnoticed. She lay on her cot holding her mother's medallion against her chest. She was exhausted. She was cold. She was alive. And for the first time in months, she smiled. The story didn't end there. Stories never end as cleanly as we want them to. Thomas Whitfield Jr. survived. He made his way north as Mercy had told him to. He reached Canada in the spring of 1853. He settled in a small town near Toronto, working as a laborer on farms that needed extra hands. He never owned another human being. Harrison Cole pursued him for months, but the chase eventually grew too expensive. Cole gave up and returned to Kentucky, where he continued his work as a slave catcher until the Civil War made that profession obsolete. The Whitfield plantation fell into confusion after Thomas's disappearance. Without an heir, the property was claimed by distant relatives who had no interest in running it. They sold the enslaved people to various buyers across the South. They sold the land to a neighbor. Mercy was sold to a plantation in Tennessee. She was 12 years old. But Mercy was not finished. She had crossed the river 15 times. She had guided 14 men to freedom. She had saved the life of her worst enemy and turned that salvation into the ultimate revenge. She knew things that no one else knew. She knew how to read the water. She knew how to move in darkness. She knew how to become invisible. The plantation in Tennessee was different from the Whitfield place, but the river was the same. The Cumberland River ran just 8 miles to the north, and beyond that lay more rivers, more paths, more ways to freedom. Within 6 months of arriving, Mercy had mapped the local waterways. Within a year, she had made contact with the Underground Railroad network in Nashville. Within 2 years, she was guiding people again. She never stopped. From 1853 to 1865, Mercy Whitfield guided an estimated 67 people to freedom. The exact number is uncertain because Mercy didn't keep records. She didn't want evidence that could be used against her. But the people she saved remembered. They remembered the small woman who appeared in the darkness. They remembered her steady hands and her calm voice. They remembered following her through waters that should have killed them, trusting her completely, arriving on the other side alive. They called her by many names: the river ghost, the water angel, Moses's daughter. She answered to all of them. When the Civil War began in 1861, Mercy was 22 years old. She had been enslaved her entire life. She had risked death more times than she could count. She had seen things that would have broken most people. She was not broken. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation changed everything. Suddenly, the river crossings weren't just escapes. They were migrations. Thousands of enslaved people walked off plantations across the South, heading north toward freedom. Mercy helped as many as she could. After the war ended, she settled in Cincinnati, just across the river from Kentucky. She lived in a small house near the waterfront. She worked as a laundress, washing clothes for wealthy families who never knew that the quiet woman scrubbing their linens had once been the most effective conductor on the Underground Railroad. She never married. She never had children. She never talked about her past with strangers. But sometimes late at night, people would knock on her door. They would be the children and grandchildren of men she had saved. They would come with questions, with gratitude, with stories they wanted to share. Mercy would listen. She would nod. She would show them her mother's medallion still hanging around her neck after all those years. And sometimes, very rarely, she would tell them about the river. She would tell them about the devil's elbow and the sandbar that no one else could find. She would tell them about the cold and the darkness and the current that tried to pull you under. She would tell them about the giants who trembled with fear until a small girl took their hands. She would tell them about the 15 crossings, 14 times for freedom, 1 time for revenge. Mercy Whitfield died in 1903 at the age of 64. She was buried in the United American Cemetery in Cincinnati in a section reserved for African Americans. Her gravestone says simply her name and her dates. It doesn't mention the river. It doesn't mention the crossings. It doesn't mention any of the things she did. But the people who knew her remembered. They remembered her hands scarred from frostbite, steady as stone. They remembered her eyes, dark and deep, seeing things that others couldn't see. They remembered her voice, soft but certain, saying, "Follow me. I know the way." The Ohio River still flows past Cincinnati. It still curves and bends, creating eddies and currents that can trap the unwary. The devil's elbow is gone now, eroded away by 150 years of floods and droughts. The sandbar that Mercy knew has vanished beneath layers of silt, but the water remembers. Every drop that passes that stretch of river carries a memory of the people who crossed it. Every ripple echoes with their footsteps. Every wave whispers their names. 14 giants who walked to freedom through the darkness. 1 enemy who learned that mercy could be the cruelest punishment of all. And 1 girl, small and brave and impossible, who changed the world 1 crossing at a time. They built a system designed to crush people like her. They built laws and chains and whips. They built an entire economy on the idea that some people were property and some people were owners. Mercy Whitfield looked at that system and found its weakness. The system was afraid of the river. The system avoided the dangerous places, the unpredictable waters, the paths that required courage and skill and faith. Mercy wasn't afraid. She made the river her weapon. She turned the thing they feared into the thing that set people free. She took children across, men who had never learned to swim, grandparents who could barely walk. She took them all and she never lost a single one. That was her gift. That was her genius. That was the thing that no amount of cruelty could take away from her. The ability to find a path where others saw only danger. The courage to walk it in the darkness. The faith to keep walking even when her body failed. History doesn't remember Mercy Whitfield. You won't find her name in the textbooks. You won't see her face in the museums. The records were never kept, or they were destroyed, or they simply never existed in the first place. But history doesn't remember most of the people who made it. It doesn't remember the children who carried messages. It doesn't remember the women who hid runaways in their cellars. It doesn't remember the men who walked 1,000 miles in the wrong direction just to throw the slave catchers off the trail. It doesn't remember the giants who found their courage in the grip of a small girl's hand. They existed anyway. They fought anyway. They won anyway. And somewhere in the cold, dark water of the Ohio River, their victory still echoes. Mercy Whitfield crossed the river 15 times. 14 times she saved other people. The 15th time she saved herself, not her body. Her body had been saved 1,000 times by luck and skill and the grace of the current. She saved something deeper. She saved the part of herself that wanted revenge more than justice. She saved the part that wanted to watch Thomas Whitfield drown. She saved the part that would have become a monster if she had let it. She pulled her enemy from the river. She gave him his life. And then she gave him something worse. She gave him the truth. The truth that he owed everything to a person he had spent his life despising. The truth that his survival depended on the mercy of someone he had never considered fully human. The truth that the system he had built his identity on was a lie. And that lie had been exposed by an 11-year-old girl standing on a riverbank in the rain. That was the real crossing. Not from Kentucky to Ohio, not from slavery to freedom, from hatred to something else. Something harder to name. Something that looked like peace. Mercy Whitfield was 11 years old when she first crossed the river. She was 64 when she died. Still wearing her mother's medallion. Still living within sight of the water that had shaped her life. In between, she became something that the slave catchers and the overseers and the plantation owners never expected. She became unstoppable. Not because she was strong. There were people stronger than her. Not because she was fast. There were people faster than her. Not because she was lucky. Luck runs out eventually. She was unstoppable because she understood something that her enemies never figured out. The river wasn't the obstacle. The river was the path. And once you understood that, once you really understood it, nothing could stand in your way. 14 giants walked across the Ohio River on a path that shouldn't have existed. Guided by a child who shouldn't have known it was there. One man was pulled from the water by the person he had hurt the most. Saved by a mercy he had never shown to anyone. And one girl born into slavery, raised in darkness, taught by a broken old man who loved her like a daughter, changed everything. She didn't change the laws. The laws changed later, written by people who never knew her name. She didn't change the system. The system collapsed under its own weight, brought down by a war that killed 600,000 people. She changed the people. One crossing at a time, one life at a time, one step at a time through the cold, dark water. That's how the world really changes. Not through speeches and proclamations, through small acts of impossible courage repeated over and over until the impossible becomes inevitable. Mercy Whitfield knew this. She lived it. She proved it with every crossing. And now, more than 150 years later, her proof still stands. The river flows on. The water is different. Every molecule replaced 1,000,000 times over. But the shape remains.